Welcome to a discussion, Reflections on Multiculturalism, sponsored by the New Canadian Centre in Peterborough, Ontario. Before any introductions, I'd like to give a land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge that we are located on the Treaty 20 Mississauga territory and in the traditional territory of the Mississauga and Chippewa nations, collectively known as the Williams Treaty's First Nations, which include Curve Lake, Hiawatha, Alderville, Scugog Island, Rama, Ossaloy, and Georgina Island First Nations. We respectfully acknowledge that the Williams Treaty's First Nations are the stewards and caretakers of these lands and waters in perpetuity, and that they continue to maintain this responsibility to ensure their health and integrity for generations to come. We are all treaty people, and we all bear this responsibility. We've heard this land acknowledgement many times, but each time, for me, I'm reminded again and again that we are visitors, and I find it personally very helpful. I am Deborah Barrell, Professor Emeritus, Trent University, and the founder of its School of Education and Professional Learning. From its inception, the School of Education was committed to promoting inclusion and social justice through education. I was a newcomer to Canada myself many years ago, but I came from a very similar culture and demographic, and my resettlement was much different from many Canadian newcomers. I have been and still am involved in Canadian refugee sponsorship and resettlement of families, individuals, and students. And I am honored to be moderating this panel today. Welcome to each of you who has joined this panel discussion, which is part of the Peterborough New Canadian Centre Multiculturalism Festival, which has been running for this past week, featuring workshops, films, dancers, musicians, and lots of food. Today is the last day of the festival, and it also marks Canadian Multiculturalism Day. It is particularly fitting that this panel today is exploring the concept of multiculturalism and its ramifications. This Zoom meeting, you will have noticed, is being recorded, and you've agreed to that by joining, and it will be shared. We ask kindly that if you have not already, that you mute your volume unless you are speaking. Thank you. Today's discussion features the following speakers: Andy Cragg. There are three, and I will introduce them and what they're going to talk about. Andy Cragg, Executive Director of the New Canadian Centre, Peterborough. Mr. Craig's master's thesis focused on Canadian immigration policy and the Temporary Foreign Worker Program. Andy was born and raised in Peterborough and was chair of the Peterborough Immigration Partnership from 2014 to 2017. His presentation today continues his interest in immigration policy. The title of his presentation is Reflections on Immigration Demographics and Cultural Integration. He will present demographic immigration statistics for Canada, setting the stage for the rest of the conversation, including aging population, the shift in source countries for Canadian immigrants over the last 50 years, the racialization of the Canadian population, the impact of these shifts on cultural integration, and pushback in the form of racism amidst a persistent majority support for immigration and multiculturalism. As well, he will present his perspectives from his experience at the New Canadian Centre. Our second speaker is Mohammed Rahman, Professor of Sociology at Trent University. Professor Rahman teaches a course on ethnicities, racism, and multiculturalism, focused on Canada. His main research areas are on queer Muslim identities, systemic racism, and Islamophobia. The title of his presentation today is From Dominance to Dependence: Immigration as the New Normal in Canada and the Implications for a White-Centered Multiculturalism. Professor Rahman will talk about the increasing rates of immigration over the last half century and ask us to reflect on how labor market-driven need impacts our understanding of multiculturalism. He will discuss The shift in multiculturalism from a management of settler Anglo and French relations towards a multi-ethnic and multiracial set of values and practices that have brought to light patterns of systemic racism in Canada, as well as hinting at the economic dependence of traditional settler cultures on new Canadians. Together with the impacts of truth and reconciliation, he will ask whether these movements help us to see the normalization of whiteness in our culture, and also whether we can navigate this decentering of a white norm without falling prey to ethno-nationalist resentments and violence. Our third speaker is Faizi Baban, Professor of Political Studies and International Development Studies at Trent University. Professor Baban's research interests include critical migration studies, cosmopolitanism, citizenship studies, and multiculturalism. The title of his presentation is Many Lives of Multiculturalism, European and Canadian Experiences. Professor Baban will discuss multiple meanings of multiculturalism to explore divergent paths of this elusive concept in various European countries and Canada. While Canada has long embraced multiculturalism as part of its social contract, there's much more skepticism in Europe about multiculturalism's ability to foster societal unity. Professor Baban will discuss various European experiences and explain why European attitudes towards multiculturalism differ from the Canadian experience. To the wider audience, we want your involvement in this conversation. We will have the three speakers first, and then there will be opportunity to ask questions and make comments at the end of the third speaker. Please jot down your thoughts as you listen. And we will start now with Andy Cragg.
Great, thank you, Deborah, and welcome everyone. I want to say thank you first off to Deborah, Mohammed, and Faizi for taking time to participate in today's discussion organized by the New Canadian Centre, and also to everyone who's participated in the many great activities organized by our team over the past week as we've celebrated Multicultural Canada Festival leading up to today, which is Canadian Multiculturalism Day. So I'm going to share my screen here and start my presentation. So as Deborah said, my name is Andy Cragg. I am the Executive Director of the New Canadian Centre, Peterborough. I'm sure most or maybe all of you are familiar with our work, but really our mission is to empower people who are new to Canada so they can be recognized as equal and valued members of Canadian society, while also providing leadership to cultivate their meaningful economic, social, and cultural inclusion in our community. Today, I'll present a series of reflections of things that are on my mind as we navigate the work that we do at the New Canadian Centre, and I think the context that we do that work in nationally as well as locally. I have to get the right keyboard here. There we go. So we have an aging population in Canada. I think that's not surprising to hear, I assume, but perhaps the kind of magnitude of that shift may be. So 50 years ago, there was about 7 working people to retired persons. Now that has shifted such that we're heading towards a ratio of more like 2 to 1 in the near future. So really, there's an economic change here driven by demographics where there's a substantial challenge about who will be the working people whose productivity, whose tax dollars fuel the economy, the social programs and systems that we have in this country. Immigration is very much the dominant way of growing and even replacing the population. So without immigration, we would be this would be looking even substantially more challenging. So looking at the census data, for those of you who, like me, are very excited about the release of census data from the 2021 census, you may know this already, but they're trickling out different pieces of it. At this point, we have information about population and recently about age. I'm looking forward in the fall to hearing more about immigration and diversity statistics that are coming out from the 2021 census. But in terms of age, what we've learned recently is that that ratio of workers to retirees in Canada is now about 3.4 to 1. Nationally, 20 years ago, that was about 6 to 1. And what it looks like in Peterborough is, no surprise, we are an older community in terms of average age. That ratio is more like 2.5 to 1, where 20 years ago it was about 3.4 to 1. So looking nationally, as of the very recent 2021 census data, about 19% of the Canadian population is age 65 or older, where Peterborough, that's 24.5%. So we're quite a bit higher than the national average in Canada, which is important when you think about what is the future of our community economically in terms of having people who are here able to do the jobs to drive the economy, as well as to provide the services to that increasingly large portion of the population that is of that retirement age. So that's one piece of context that I think is important in talking about immigration and its importance in Canadian society and economy. Another piece is around who is coming, who is getting in, who is here in our community that is coming from different parts of the world. So there's really been an interesting phenomenon happening, especially over the last 10, 15 years. There's been an increasing trend where there's more and more temporary residents to Canada. So last year was the highest ever year for new permanent residents in Canada's history, over 400,000, which is, you know, a large number. But there were more than twice that many temporary people coming in on a temporary permit of some form. And you can see the different breakdown of those categories. A large proportion of temporary migrants are international students, and you can see at the other chart here on the bottom right the substantial growth in the number of international students over the last several years. And so increasingly, there's more and more people who are in the country, not as permanent residents with a clear track towards citizenship, but as temporary residents. But importantly, they're very much engaged in the economy. They're literally here already working, doing things, being a part of our community, but with this non-permanent status. And in many cases, they transition to permanent residency. And you can see that number here, 32% transition to permanent residence through one pathway or another. And we know from studies that the majority of international students would like to or intend to make that transition, but certainly not all of them do, or not all of them do easily, or even have a pathway clearly open to them. Which, you know, for example, I think the most well-known example of that is the seasonal agricultural workers program, the farm workers program, where it'd be very difficult, if not impossible, for someone to transition to permanent residency and citizenship. And I think interestingly, and this is part of what I studied in my master's thesis, is employers in Canada who employ people who are here on a temporary work permit of one form or another are generally very supportive of pathways to permanence for people because it's employees who they have already invested in and who they want to be able to stay. So, you know, I was going to say who gets in, and clearly from the previous slide, it's not who gets in, it's who gets permanent residence. There's lots of people who get in, but not all of them get permanent residence. Breaking down the new permanent residents from last year, again, the record number, the majority of our immigrants are still economic based. There's an economic reason that they come here. They have education and language ability such that they make it through one of our many different pathways. The next biggest category is sponsored family members of those individuals, and a decent number are refugees. But I think that's important to highlight that context, that resettled refugees and protected persons in Canada, that is a relatively small portion of new permanent residents in Canada. It's usually about 10 to 15%. Last year was a bit higher than normal as the government tried to make up for low numbers in 2020 caused by the pandemic. So thinking about cultural integration and, you know, who are the newcomers to Canada who are in our country? Where did they come from? There's more as of 2016. So this is the most recent data we have is from 2016. There's over 7.5 million foreign-born people into Canada, and you can see from this map that they really do come from all around the world. And particularly though, you can see the areas in red of Europe and United States and China, India, Philippines. Asia in general are areas where there's a large number of people who were born in those countries who are in Canada. And that is a shift that's towards countries outside of Europe and United States. That's a shift that's really increased in the last 50 years. And you can see that kind of change here, which we're starting to see the effect of that. And I think it'll come in when we talk about cultural integration and what multiculturalism means now in Canada, practically speaking. Where in 1971, so this is where people had come from in terms of immigration in the previous 5 years, that until 1971, that was the majority from Europe and the United States, and how that's really shifted over the last 50 years. And we can see that that is changing the makeup of the immigrant population, or the population of Canada who are foreign born, and that more and more that's from more countries around the world, and that is having an impact on the what's the census category of visible minority or racialized Canadians, where as of 2016, that was 21% of the Canadian population was identified as racialized, whereas in 2001, that was 13%. And that, I think it's important to recognize that that is not evenly spread out across the country. That's a national figure, and we can see that that varies from downtown Toronto versus Peterborough versus other communities. So for example, in Peterborough in the 2016 census, it was less than 5% in that visible minority category, whereas you go to a community like Brampton and it was over 73%. So it's really, even though the national figure is 23%, that there's quite a difference depending what community you're talking about. But I think it's clear when you look at the changing source countries of immigrants, as well as the growth in the racialized population of Canada, that that is where the country is heading demographically and economically. In terms of our reliance on immigration with an aging population, it's clear that that is what we need to have happen and where we're heading. So thinking about the impact of that on culture, what does that mean? What is Canadian culture in that context? You have the stereotypes around maple syrup and hockey and outdoors and nature, and that starts to shift and become more complex. And I think that's the point I really want to drive home, is that it becomes more complicated, where historically it was really dominated by people of British and French descent, with the multicultural as a third category, and Indigenous cultures largely marginalized or even subjugated. Now we have increasingly more and more people with connections culturally to different cultures from around the world, and who are in Canada, and that really becomes part of what Canadian culture is. And I think about the work that we do at the New Canadian Centre, where we are specifically helping to connect people who are new to Canada to this community that they find themselves in, and to understand what Canadian culture is. And for me, as someone who grew up in Peterborough, I can remember my personal context from that position of learning about other cultures that from people around the world as being of interest, as enriching to me, but of being different from Canadian culture, and that they would also learn about Canadian culture, which is represented by these stereotypes of hockey, of nature, wildlife, maple syrup, pancakes. But now that is less clear. When you have people who don't particularly like Tim Hortons coffee, who haven't played hockey ever, or you have a fourth generation Asian Canadian who is making it to the NHL. You have someone like me who could learn how to salsa dance and have that be a main part of my kind of cultural expression. It gets really complicated. And so now we're in this situation, and we can see that with our programming and our perspective at the New Canadian Centre, where we can organize a Multicultural Canada Festival, and that literally is learning about Canadian culture. That literally now is Canadian culture. Part of learning about what that is actually understanding each other. And so I think that's an interesting shift that is happening and will only increase over time. The flip side of that is that as the number of racialized Canadians increases, and as that complexity of cultural experiences increases, that there's pushback, from what were dominant groups as they feel that. This is a graph of police reported hate crimes, and you can see that the majority categories here are on the basis of what motivated the hate crime is race and ethnicity and religion. And there is a trend towards that increasing over time, and the majority of those incidents are related to race and religion. And in Peterborough, we did a study at the New Canadian Centre last year that showed that it was a survey of newcomers to Canada who live in our community, that 25% of them had experienced some form of racism or discrimination in the last year. And it's that in the last year piece that I think, I would say it's shocking, except it's not surprising. But nonetheless, when you think that's in the last year, essentially that statistic to me is saying that most people who are here in our community who are racialized have experienced some form of racism or discrimination in our community. And our approach at the New Canadian Centre is to try to counter that with positive experiences, and that are empowering experiences and storytelling, really, that highlight the positive contributions of newcomers to Canada, as well as humanizing those experiences and those people. But still, that tension is very much there and real, and those experiences are a reality that people face day to day. The other piece of that context, though, is that the majority of Canadians are still supportive of immigration. You can see that the majority still support immigration in general, and that the impact of immigration is, there's about half would say that it makes Canada a better place, a third are ambivalent, and then there's this kind of persistent 10 to 15% that are opposed to it, but still a clear majority are still supportive. So trying to tie all of these somewhat divergent reflections together, I think from my perspective, it's clear that we need more immigration for economic and demographic reasons. And there's lots of people who are here already just as temporary residents. So let's facilitate them being permanent residents and work to reduce that kind of two-tiered temporary versus permanent immigration process, which the federal government is doing some work on. And thinking about actual multiculturalism accelerating, and that Canadian culture is becoming more complex and multifaceted. And I don't want to make this overly positive, but I think we should embrace that and enjoy the benefits while having our eyes open about the ongoing experiences of racism and discrimination, and supporting those who are affected by it. So I'll pause there and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much, Andy. And Mohammed, could we ask you to speak next?
Sure. Thanks, Deborah, and thanks everybody for being here. And again, I would thank the New Canadian Centre for setting this up and inviting us. And Andy has come to class for me and told the students about what goes on there. So that's been really useful, and I hope we can continue our relationship. I also just want to acknowledge the people that have done work for many years on the Community Race Relations Committee in Peterborough as well. We've often worked together as well. So I know there's a bunch of people doing good work in town. So I'm an immigrant. I've been here for 15 years. I just got my email from the Dean congratulating me on 15 years service at Trent. I think it's service, or like your sentence is 15 years, your parole is still about 5 years away, I guess. So I've been here, and I started as a permanent resident, as Andy was describing. And I want to talk a bit about just the shift that I've seen. Again, I think it's a positive shift in the students in teaching that class. I think there's a lot more literacy amongst the younger generation of issues around multiculturalism. I think particularly the Truth and Reconciliation process has really raised an understanding of the kind of colonial heritage of Canada as a settler nation. And I think that's been positive. I also think since the murder of George Floyd a couple of years ago, we saw a worldwide kind of reaction to that, which I think was kind of nuanced in its own national culture. But I think a common theme there was a kind of public discussion of the nature of institutional or systemic discrimination. So, and I think that's been really positive, because that's moved us away from this idea that racism is just, the kind of fault of flawed individuals, towards thinking more sociologically about why institutions don't shift, and why they may, retain particular patterns. And that's really, I think that's really been a positive movement, because we're starting to think about these structures in society, whichever society that's done. In the States, it's focused a lot on policing, and that has, that's been partly the case here, but it's also focused us on things like the education system. So I feel that there's a kind of expanding understanding of issues around particularly racialization, and I think that that's been a positive movement. I also think it's kind of an indication of some shift in that relationship between the three pillars that Andy identified. Excuse me. So often, I'm just going to refer to the world's leading theorist of multiculturalism is a Canadian scholar called Will Kimlicker, who's just down the road at Queen's, and he says, our version of diversity has been built on recognizing these three distinct pillars: the Anglophone, Francophone population and management between them, indigenous cultures, and the area that he really focuses on, which is what he describes as kind of ethnic multiculturalism. And Andy gave us the figures for that demonstrates that that's accurate. I think those two issues around the TRC and a kind of increasing recognition of racism as a kind of social force, those, I think, are having some impact on that third pillar, which is the traditional pillar of Anglo and French cultures. And that's really what I'm kind of interested in thinking about, because I think we're in a period of transition. We may just be at the beginning of that period of transition, but the fact is that those are not just three pillars, they're actually a hierarchy. And Anglo and French cultures, as the kind of original colonial cultures, are really at the top of that hierarchy. And in fact, by most socioeconomic measures, it's recent or more recent immigrants who are mostly ethnically racialized are second in that hierarchy, and indigenous cultures, by all markers like health, education, are at the bottom. So we still have this kind of legacy of colonialism that indigenous peoples are suffering from much more directly. But we also have a situation in which particularly racialized, but not only racialized, also ethnic migrants who are not, who are white, can still suffer from exclusions. Now that might be part of what a normal pattern of immigration. Lots of immigration studies show that, new populations come in, they take some time to kind of learn learn how to navigate the labor market and educational systems. And then oftentimes they kind of move on up throughout the host culture. So, that might be partly what's going on. And I think, as Andy demonstrated, this is a labor market driven policy in Canada, right? Like, it is overwhelmingly an economic class migration. I came through the economic class category as well. Luckily, they don't ask what your PhD is in, but having a PhD gives you maximum points. They didn't interrogate that it was a PhD in sociology and question whether that was useful economically. But that's how I got here, and that's really the main driver. So there may be labor market integration, social economic integration, but I think we're seeing also manifestations of what I would say is probably inevitable, but they're quite negative manifestations, but it's about destabilizing the dominant culture. So let me just explain to you what I mean about that. Some very, difficult examples to kind of think about, but there have been targeted murders of Muslims in Canada over the last few years. Canada actually is quite distinct in having had more of those than most other, I think almost every other Western country, where they've been receiving Muslim migrants. So the Quebec City mosque shooting and the sort of running down of the Muslim family in London last year. Now, of course, individually, I think a lot of people, you know, understand those as kind of isolated incidents by, you know, white men who were radicalized somehow online through white supremacist ideology. But let's not necessarily think about the individual motivations. Let's think about the discourses that are out there, the ways of making sense of that action, to take action to actually attack somebody. That isn't just restricted to extremist meaning systems. You know, that's also reinforced by everyday actions or laws or assumptions in Canada. You think about the kind of secularism bill in Quebec, you know, is targeting religious minorities. But of course, the vast majority of people that's going to affect are Muslims and has affected are Muslims. So that reiterates something to people who are uncomfortable about Muslims fitting in. And it kind of mirrors the statistical evidence that we have. There's a great stat from an analysis in 2010 where 86% of Canadians surveyed valued multiculturalism as a core part of Canadian identity. I think that also reinforces some of the points Andy was making. And you know, that's a huge figure. That's actually a really positive figure, right? 86%. And then I loved reading when I was doing the research for this, that was kind of similar to things like the healthcare service, you know, which is important to us. But it's actually above hockey and the Queen in terms of that survey at that time. I mean, I don't know why the Queen would be that important, but certainly hockey you'd think would be something people reach for quicker. But when you dig down into that stat, the vast majority of people also think that immigrants should fit in, right? So they are much less open to people having different, you know, religious practices that are too, you know, extreme, much less open to people having their own languages validated. So it's not a negative set of facts, but it's a conditional acceptance of multiculturalism about people fitting in. And guess who they think fits in the least? On that survey, it's actually Muslims that they think fit in the least into Canada. So there's still this assumption that, you know, you need to reach up to and conform with our version of what Canada is, and that's the dominant Anglo-French settler culture. And I think some of the incidents we've seen are a reflection of the destabilization of that culture, that we're in a period where we are actually having to recognize that multiculturalism as a kind of practice and a set of laws was developed primarily to manage Anglophone, Francophone relationships, and then increasingly to manage these kind of new racialized ethnic populations. But we're in a period where they're not really the minority anymore, or we're not really the minority anymore. You know, there are some urban areas where new immigrants, and particularly racialized immigrants, are going to be the majority within a generation. And that means that our systems, our institutions have to change to acknowledge that fact, as Andy was pointing out. And I think we're still in a period where we're trying to navigate what that means. I think that also, you know, I think it's an interesting period for us to be in, but also the other issue that's going to raise, and this is partly because I do work on LGBT cultures and I wanted to mention it, and also because there was a targeted murder of queer people in Oslo over the weekend. That's going to raise increasing conflicts around different values of diversity. And we have to have some way of kind of managing that or navigating that and understanding that. We've seen that in Ontario a few years ago with the sex education curriculum. Lots of religious groups, and including lots of Muslim family groups, were involved in lobbying against that new curriculum that was more inclusive of gender and sexual diversity. I think we're also seeing some resistance, and perhaps Deborah might know a bit more about this, to a curriculum at school that talks a bit more honestly about the histories of racialization and race. I think a lot of students come into, say, my class, for example, and their schooling has been kind of the happy multicultural history of Canada, rather than a kind of acknowledgement that there have been systemic oppressions. And certainly a lot of them do not understand that multiculturalism is driven by the labor market. And in fact, we would not survive as a country, it looks like, economically, unless we continued immigration. And that's kind of what I meant about that shift from dominance to dependence. So these, this kind of culture of Anglo-French historical settlement is really kind of being destabilized by the reality of who's here. And it's being destabilized by the political rise in consciousness around indigenous issues. And I don't know where we're going to end up, but I think that that's partly why we see some of these fairly fierce reactions to that destabilization, because there is no clear pathway. The other thing that I think it's important for us to think about is that there is some response to that from our political leaderships, and I don't think that it's very honest. So we actually don't have an articulation from the really strongly pro-immigration parties that immigration is in fact necessary for the future economic success of, and maybe not even the development or increasing economic success, just the maintenance of the tax base and public programs that come out of that. There's some hint of that in their discussions, but nobody ever says, listen, people, if we don't continue doing this, our system is going to collapse. And what is that? Why are they reluctant to do that? And I don't have an answer, but I'm just asking us to think about that. Is that partly because they don't want to offend settled traditional populations? They don't want to say to them, you know what, you're in decline and you're not the future of this country. And in fact, we need all these younger racialized people to come in and pay tax so that we can manage your healthcare. Now, obviously, in a democratic system, that's not a great thing to say to people. But how do we navigate that when that's actually the reality? I think Ontario has last year lobbied for some extra permanent residence spots for healthcare workers after COVID. Right, so it's becoming quite obvious that that's what we're doing. But there's a reluctance or an inability to acknowledge that that's challenging the dominance of traditional white cultures. I think our leadership is sometimes cynical as well, and this is perhaps more identified with more conservative elements. But you think back to 2015 and 2016, where the Harper government proposed removing citizenship or not allowing people to swear citizenship if they're wearing a niqab or a face covering. I think some of us will remember that. And that actually, the polling showed that their support rose during that period where they were discussing that. But interestingly, when they proposed the barbaric cultural practices tip line, a hotline where you could call in and say, oh, these kind of weird people are doing weird things, their support dropped. And Will Kimlicker has written about this. So that maybe was a kind of indication of the resilience of core Canadian multiculturalism. We want people to fit in, but if you're going to start stigmatizing people, we're not there for that. So that's probably a hopeful sign too. But nonetheless, the stigmatization of particular groups and Muslims continues in laws and policies, not just in Quebec, but also around the country. I wonder if, we're also in a period where trying to understand that we do need some kind of shared culture, right? We need some kind of shared culture. And so this is from the other side. And if we're saying, okay, well, that sort of dominant version of history and economic development is shifting because of the immigration patterns, we still need to be able to say, okay, there are things that we share as a culture. There are things that we agree upon as a culture from the other side, from the multicultural and the ethnic side. And I don't know that we have much of a debate about that, because in fact, most ethnic groups and recent immigrants are in a period of community building or articulating against the system, saying, no, we need a better education system, we need more culturally appropriate services. And so they're challenging existing systemic patterns, but we're not really sure what's going to come out of that. What would be the new normal in terms of what education would look like? what would be the new normal in terms of how we make sure that social services from healthcare to social work to care homes are culturally sensitive. So I think we're still in a period of trying to work through what that means as well. So, I think there are some positive elements to Canadian multiculturalism. I think it's a flexible sense of what we are, but the reality of it is that we're actually now destabilizing and going through a period where one component of that, perhaps the hidden component, but the kind of assumed component that there's a dominant Anglo-Francophone white European norm, is really being exposed for what it is, which is increasingly a kind of historically dominant and oppressive culture, but also one that is no longer relevant as the dominant framework through which we include or think about Canadian multiculturalism. And I think it's a really fascinating period, and I'm trying to work through what that means Canada would be. Would we be a post-multicultural nation once we've worked through those decline and destabilization? But that destabilization is what is also a dangerous point for us, as we've seen, because there are some reactions to it and some negative responses to it, both politically and individually. Okay, I will finish there. I'll just end on a quick anecdote. As part of my permanent residence process, I had to, and this is the cynical part, I had to spend almost $1,000 doing my English language proficiency training. So I'm from the UK, originally the United Kingdom. I was educated in English. All my studies were in English, including a PhD. I'd written a couple of books at that point in English. And I was forced to do, I was very, very resentful. And because I was so resentful, I actually didn't score full marks. But Trent let me keep my job. I don't think I told them. So there you go. Thanks. I'll pass it on to Deborah.
Thanks so much, Mo. And these are the English language thing. It continues to happen for sure. I remember when I took my Canadian citizenship oath, how surprised I was to be swearing allegiance to the Queen. That took me aback completely. Nobody had told me about that. So interesting. There's a lot of interesting points that you raise here. Lots to follow up. Folks who are in the audience, I hope you're jotting down lots of notes. So thank you very much. And Facey, we're over to you now, please.
Thank you very much, Deborah, and thank you again to New Canadian Centre to organize this panel and bringing us together to talk about this important issue. And we actually value New Canadian Centre's contribution not only in Peterborough to newcomers, but also to Trent community as well. With our students, our cooperation always enriches the Trent community as well. So this is particularly important, for me to be here and I thank again for organizing this panel. Now, today I'm going to talk about these divergent responses to multiculturalism and sort of open the debate up a little bit more, because Andy and Mohammed gave us a lot of really thought-provoking points about the culture, Canadian multiculturalism. But the multiculturalism as a concept is not actually always celebrated or welcomed in other Western liberal democracies. And my approach and interpretation of multiculturalism is always fragmented by the Canadian experience where I live and work, and the Western European responses where I do most of my research, because as some of you may know, in most of Europe, multiculturalism is seen at best, with lukewarm reaction and hostility at worst. So, given the official celebration of Canadian multiculturalism, that the response in Europe is, is very different. So I will talk about this a little bit and try to reflect on the Canadian experience. But multiculturalism, in its essence, asks a very simple question, and that question is, how do we live together? It is a simple question, but it is actually a difficult one to answer. It's a complicated one. And when you actually add another word to that question, and that is, how do we live with difference? The answer gets even more complicated and even harder, and it becomes political and controversial. And that controversy usually lies at this tension between the dominant national cultures that, Mohammed, for instance, talked about in the Canadian case, and certainly in Europe as well, and the cultural plurality that comes with others, but also internal others as well, the ethnic others, the religious others, the sexual others, who demand inclusion, who demand recognition, who demand distribution within the public sphere. That comes with these multicultural demands, and it creates an anxiety, and it creates a discomfort at the very heart of these national ideologies. So the tension between unified national identity and the cultural pluralism emerging from multicultural demands is at the heart of this issue. That's what actually makes this question of how we live together a complicated one. So I don't have the time here to go into details of the immense theoretical debate about multiculturalism, but I'll talk about some of the assumptions to perhaps maybe open up this national discomfort about multiculturalism, particularly in the European case. Charles Taylor, for instance, it's interestingly enough, actually, Canada is one place where the majority of the contribution to multiculturalism debate in the literature is actually done. It's mostly Canadian writers, and some of that work actually has not been translated into French or Dutch or in other languages. In France, for instance, there is still not a translation of Charles Taylor's influential essay, The Politics of Recognition. It hasn't been translated, and very few people actually read that essay in France. But in that essay, Charles Taylor outlines the key preoccupation of multiculturalism as the need to recognize members of society who have different cultural, ethnic, and religious backgrounds as equals. And that as equals, of course, is very important because that very definition itself refuses to give any kind of dominance or hierarchy to an established national culture. As Mohammed was saying, that once we actually recognize that, it destabilizes the very nature of national identities, and hence the controversy about the multiculturalism in many European countries. So I'll talk about some of these controversies and some of these responses to multiculturalism that's emerging from this anxiety in Europe, which it sort of goes way beyond some of the anxieties and perhaps we observe and see in the Canadian context. And in Europe, one also has to acknowledge that there are different responses. It's not a blanket response. There is the extreme hostility, for instance, as in the Danish case. And then, there are reluctant acceptances of multiculturalism in UK and in Holland and in between from Germany and France, that we see all these responses. But the one example, for instance, the glaring one about this anxiety is the Danish ghetto law. In 2018, the Danish parliament passed this law. It's called the ghetto law, which actually the name is the ghetto law. It's not like people were referring it. That's how the law was passed in 2018, and it targets predominantly Muslim minority population, designating 25 neighborhoods as ghettos which were selected by income, employment, and non-Western background, stipulating that ghetto children must be separated from their families for at least 25 hours a week, and also the surveillance, surveilling the designating these ghetto neighborhoods. So now here, I have to emphasize that the people who are subjected to this ghetto law are Danish citizens. And in most cases, they are second generation Danish citizens who are born and raised in Denmark and speaking Danish. But if they actually happen to be living in one of those designated ghetto communities, then they become subject to that law. That means that their children are separated 25 hours a week. The communities are surveilled. And in 2021, the Danish government introduced a second law. And in that case, they scrapped the ghetto designation for obvious reasons, given the European history, the discomfort, the word that ghetto creates, that they had to actually, and there's a lot of controversy around it. So they took the ghetto designation out, but they even actually went further and saying that, that they now aim to reduce the number of non-Western residents in any given community to a maximum of 30% in 10 years, and relocate families removed from these areas into other parts of the country. So basically what that means is that the Danish government removes what it deems non-Western citizens, quote unquote, into areas without their choice and without actually giving them a choice where to be relocated, which they've started doing that. They're already evacuating people from their communities. So that doesn't really jive with our image of democratic Denmark with the happiest people living in the world. But I suspect that people living in those communities are not part of the happy Danish community. And the Danish immigration minister, Søren Pind, kind of sort of summed up his approach to quote unquote integration, and quote, that's his statement, "I really don't want to hear any more about integration. Please stop. The right word must be assimilation. There are so many cultures and people can go elsewhere and engage with them if that's what they want." So the ghetto law actually is introduced by the conservative governments, but now it's being implemented and supported by the Social Democrats government in Denmark. So the examples that we see in Europe, most of the time we think about the extreme right wing formulating these responses, but that's actually far from being the truth. It's much more embedded into everyday culture. In Germany, for instance, the attitude has always been ambivalent towards multiculturalism, even though 20% of German population has an immigrant background. For a long time, there has been a denial of the immigrant reality of German society. Famously, I think it was 6 or 7 years ago, Angela Merkel, German chancellor, there's a famous statement, and she said that the multiculturalism has failed, utterly failed in Germany. This was ironic because there has never been an official multiculturalism in Germany, so it wasn't actually quite clear, what it failed. But in 2017, the German Interior Minister, and that's Thomas de Maizière, wrote an article in the Bild newspaper. And in that, he explained his plan to encourage German lead culture as the basis for integrating immigrants, which would work as a yardstick for coexistence. And in it, he sort of had a 10-point plan where he had a list of certain items where immigrants had to learn and conform. And he said, quote, "We Germans, we are the heirs of history with all its highs and lows. Our past shapes our present and our culture." And his list included things like shaking hands, knowing Bach and Goethe. He didn't include Nietzsche in that, I'm not quite sure why. The minister continued, "We shake hands, show our faces, and tell what our names are. We don't do burqa." And, this was, became quite a debate, but more so, that was in 2010, Thilo Sarrazin, a member of a German Social Democratic Party, but also executive member of an executive board of Deutsche Bundesbank executive, wrote a book called Germany Does Away with Itself, and became a bestseller in Germany. And in that book, Sarrazin started with the common argument that Muslims were unwilling and unable to integrate into German society, attributing their failure to integrate to cultural differences and genetic disposition. Sarrazin raised the alarm about the high birth rate of Muslims and the potential danger of ethnic Germans being taken over by Muslims eventually. He further emphasized that because Muslims are genetically less intelligent than ethnic Germans, their increasing numbers would lead to dumbing down the German culture. And that was a best-selling book in Germany for a long time, debated on TV programs, and then and Sarrazin was a member of the German Social Democratic Party. It became a very uncomfortable situation to deal with German social democrats. But in response to Sarrazin, the German philosopher Habermas's sort of rebuttal actually went right to the real cause of this controversy and pointed out the real issue here, and that is the feeling of an endangered national culture, which had to assert itself as the elite culture that all newcomers must follow. So that's, what Mohammed was indicating, some of this destabilization. And in European case that we see that feeling of destabilization manifests itself in a much more explicit and racist undertones in the mainstream, not just in the extreme right wing. When we look at the French case, for instance, the French Republican universality refuses to accept any claims of cultural plurality in the public sphere and sees claims of recognition as divisive, because the idea is that French constitution recognized the equality of citizens irrespective of their differences. But nevertheless, that actually hasn't prevented from at least 15 French towns passing legislation banning Muslim swimming dress in beach towns, where now police actually regularly patrols and asks women to remove the swimming the garb. So when we actually talk about the Republican universality, the Republican universality, of course, is not a universality. It's a very culturally specific a phenomenon. It's very much embedded into a certain French ethnic history, but it passes itself as an abstract universality against which all other minorities are supposed to conform. So, these examples that one can continue with many of them, in Britain, for instance, in 2000s, it was the Ted Cantill's, the Community Integration Report, and generated a lot of debate. That Mohammed would know that as well. In Dutch case, since I'll be running out of time, that I will not continue with those examples, but I think that gives you an enough idea about this unease and discomfort between established national cultures and the demands of cultural plurality that comes from these multicultural frameworks. The Canadian situation, as Andy and Mohammed indicated, is quite different. And it's quite different actually in a positive way that we need to acknowledge that. And again, both, I think Mohammed especially sort of mentioned that Kimlicka's definition of why the Canadian case is more open to multicultural demands, because from the beginning, the Canadian national experience has been a messy one. And it was kind of sort of intentionally, but unintentionally, never fit into the European type of very homogeneous, stable, perceived national framework. But the existence of the federalism, which tries to reconcile the national governance with vast geographical differences, that's just at one level. The second level, the Quebec nationalism and its constant disruption against any attempt to consolidate national identity, the persistence of the indigenous demands of self-government and protection of indigenous cultural rights. And finally, the ethnic and cultural differences encouraged by Canada's immigration policy actually makes it very difficult for, for European style, homogeneous, integrated, dominant cultural fixed point against which the newcomers are supposed to assimilate. So it's easy for us to perhaps to look at a rather depressing situation in Europe, which is actually, it is depressing when you look at it in its totality and celebrate the culture and Canadian multiculturalism. But I think when we kind of sort of scratch the surface, the official status of multiculturalism in Canada manifests itself in multiple levels and contradictory interpretations. So the Canadian multiculturalism may be strong at the surface level, but when we look at deep into its layers, we see many cracks, inconsistencies, and tensions. And I think Mohammed is really nicely illustrated that. And for a long time, the Canadian scholars also, scholars like Imane Banerjee, Sunara Tobani, the Grace Edward Galibuzi, Shirin Rezak, Ronaldo Walcott, right? That they've all been actually talking about the impact of Canadian multiculturalism in terms of normalizing and neutralizing and also sustaining the existing hierarchies under the guise of equality and diversity. Sedef Arad Koch and Sunara Tobani and Shirin Rezak, for instance, they argued that tolerance in Canadian multiculturalism involves a fundamental inequality of power between those who tolerate and those who are tolerated. And again, Ronaldo Walcott argued that the rhetoric of diversity never translated in Canada into anti-racist practices, including so-called equity policies that bring individualistic advantages rather than systemic changes and radical transformations. So I think, before I finish, I would like to point out that the Canadian experience, I think, intersect at these two moments. On the one hand, some of these, the critiques have been, raised by Canadian scholars about the managing and normalizing cultural plurality in Canada. It's rightly so. But as someone who does a lot of work in Europe, I also have to nuance these critiques in the sense that the Canadian pluralism actually manages and negotiates itself very much differently than the European reality, so that the official discourse of multiculturalism and the official discourse in Canada and perhaps lead to a certain type of management, but it also opens up unexpected and unintentional political space where Mohammed indicated it creates this ambiguity, but that ambiguity also allows us to think about what kind of society that we are imagining. Because the main difference, in my opinion, in that in Europe, that moment of asking what kind of society we would like, how we actually live together, what is our shared culture, that perhaps it's possible to ask these questions in Canada, but in Europe at this point, it's not possible to ask those questions yet. So I'll stop and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Faizi. So lots of things I've been scribbling like mad here and highlighting and trying to figure out. First of all, there was a bit in the chat, and I'd like to follow up initially with a question from Simal. If Simal, if you would mind unmuting yourself and wanting to follow up things around the English test, going back to Moment's last comments.
Yeah, sorry I put that in the chat there instead of waiting for the Q&A, but Moment, I found that really interesting because my master's thesis is on Western education and the refugee experience for students in Canada. And one of the things I noticed in the research was the English literacy test that they all have to take, and how that immediately kind of places them as being disabled because they can't pass it. They don't know the culture of English in Canada or the language. So there really is no choice for them to really pass. So it's interesting that they have to take it and that they're always usually diagnosed as ESL immediately. And then my other question was just, was there a link to the data specifically? I know you were talking about the survey, which was really interesting with the 86% of Canadians conditionally accepting multiculturalism. And I was just wondering where that came from.
Moment, you're still muted.
I thought I'd unmuted, sorry. Yeah, thanks for those points. I'm just getting up my notes from that survey. I was actually quoting a piece of academic research, so it's probably not, I'm just trying to, that was an analysis done by,
Do you know what, maybe
Pond. Yeah, sorry.
you put it in the chat?
Yeah, it's, oh yeah, but it was, actually, no, that was, it was an analysis that was done for data that you can access on the Environics polling site. So it was from, they're like a polling firm, but they have a website, so you could have a look at that data. I thought there was some easy access to it. So it's called Environics, which is a kind of big polling firm. Yeah, the language tests, and you know, it can be French or English, right? That would be the qualification. But this is an interesting thing for us to think about, because you know, we might see that language test as kind of like, you know, demanding a particular set of values, and it, you know, knowing the dominant language. But on the other hand, economic integration is going to be much easier if you speak the language, right? Or if you're going to be coming to do a job. So there's so that's one of those things that I kind of think, well, it's kind of an enabling resource to come in, and you know, and we're just stuck with, it happens to be French and English, right? Like we're kind of stuck with that historically. But that's the pathway to economic integration, and that's important because you don't want to disadvantage people. But yeah, you get this notion that, you know, that sometimes gets played out politically as fitting in with our values, right? Whereas there's, again, I was saying there's a bit of cynicism about that. That's really about your ability to participate in the economic system. I remember a few years ago, I think Faizi can tell me if I got this right, that there was a proposal to make sure that everybody could speak the language. I think this is in the UK, and you know, that family members had come over, older family members, right, who were not economically active, and there was this kind of debate about, oh well, they should be able to speak, you know, English, you know, but their grandmothers sitting at home who are doing childcare, who don't really need to participate in the economy. So what if they're speaking Turkish or Bengali? It doesn't really matter, right? So there's that cynical use of that. So I understand with the language thing, but it would also, it's actually really about economic integration, but we're just not honest about it.
Right.
I wanted to follow up as well, the notions that have been throughout everybody's presentations of national ideologies And I loved, Faisy, your phrase of messy, the messy Canadian, well, I would say the obsession the whole time that I've been in Canada of who are we, and the question of, and as a potentially very helpful thing. And also talk about the economics of representation, and both by federal and provincial government, and also by business. And I'm wondering if there is, when I think of the multiple prongs of how we might be moving forward, I'm interested in your responses, either Mohammed or Faisy or Andy, about who we are and who gets represented in media. Any one of you could jump in.
Andy had his hand up, I think, maybe in response to the previous question. So why don't you let him go first, and then Faisy, and then me.
Perfect.
Great. Yeah, just on the language piece, and it's, I think, related, but there's increasing conversation about approaching access to services, particularly public services, regardless of your language. So in the language of your choice, and analogies being made to movements around accessibility that have taken place over the last 20 years, whereas now it's becoming a norm, especially in Ontario, but I think in most provinces have similar legislation that you should be able to access public services regardless of any physical disability or other kind of disability you may have. And a similar like thinking, and I think this is driven by the multicultural complexity and confronting that dominance of English and French, of why not language as well, you know, and I think we see that at the New Canadian Centre, that sure, you might have someone who comes through as a skilled, quote unquote, skilled immigrant and has a job right away, and by virtue of having come through that process speaks English relatively well, but they might have a spouse or a child or parent or grandparent who is also here and who needs to be able to carry out their life in Canada. And you know, that language is a main barrier to that. So we clearly don't, and I think certainly this is the case in a community like Peterborough, we don't have that expectation that someone should have that right even to that level of accessing services in a language of their choice. The expectation is more still, you know, you need to speak English or French or learn that, and maybe we'll provide an interpreter for you, or see if there's anyone in the room who happens to speak that language that can communicate with you. But when you bring in the idea of that historical Anglo-French dominance, like why is there such state support for those languages? And it's playing out in Quebec, you know, most blatantly, that there's state support for the preservation of the French language and culture, but language is a huge part of that. And whereas in the communities and linguistic communities that are part of that multiculture, the multiculture of Canada, who are also actively preserving their languages, but without the support of the state as an official language. And you layer on top of that the lack of official recognition of Indigenous languages. I mean, look at what Mary Simon went through with, you know, with the fact that she speaks an Indigenous language. It just happens to not be English or French. And again, it's just another example of that complexity of a multicultural country.
This bears in as well. So I think Mohammed and Faisy, I'm not sure who is going to come next with what, because we are really focused here on national identities, which is great. It seems that that's our key today.
You know, Deborah, I think you raised a you know, very important question. This you know, this question of who are we? And, you know, in Canada, there is, you know, endless discussion of who are we, and it constantly moves and changes. It's almost agonistic. And I'll tie this up to a very important point that here Neil made in the chat. He wrote a long a series of thoughts in there. And thank you, Neil, because I think there are lots of important points in there. And the one thing that he mentions, which is actually quite important, in the European and the Canadian context, the big difference is that Canada defines itself as an immigrant country, quote unquote, and many European countries see themselves as sort of like a complete national societies with ethnic and historical background. It's all kind of full in its historical completeness. So therefore, there is something established here, and whoever comes and comes to that and has to assimilate or they have to go back, as was the case, as he mentions, in the guest workers. Whereas in the Canadian case, we're talking about an immigration society. But here, though, what I would like to mention is that Canada has not always defined itself as an immigrant society, as an immigration society, until the immigration laws changed in Canada, right? That there was an active attempt in Canada to define itself with the dominant French and English culture, as Mohammed was mentioning. But at some point, this question of who are we actually led the Canadian context to change that definition. So now I think what I see in Europe is that that Europe is in many European societies, is at that intersection of asking that question and perhaps, and they're facing the reality of giving a different answer. When I started my research in Germany, and that was around, I believe, 2002, 2003, and there was actually a refusal of acceptance that Germany was an immigrant society. It was an absolute rejection. And always, you would hear this from everyone else, including left politicians and left groups. So Germany is not an immigrant society. Now in 2022, that's where I give Germany, because it's a very slow change. So now everybody from right, not the extreme right, but right to left, they say, okay, Germany is an immigrant society. We need to acknowledge this. 20% of German society is immigrants, so the Germanness is different. But what are we going to do about this? So now the debate shifted, and who are we now includes immigrants. But when we say, well, who are we? Now there isn't actually a clear answer to that in Germany. Whereas in France, there is a complete denial. In Denmark, there is a complete denial. So that's why this question of who are we is a very important one. And one of the reasons is that why there is so much controversy, discomfort, and also overt racism in Europe is because the refusal to ask that question and the acceptance that the national communities and societies transform, there's nothing actually fixed about them. Germanness is not fixed. The Germany actually came very late into the idea of nation state, consolidated all sorts of differences. The France consolidated, over 100 ethnic nationalities to create this French identity. So there's nothing fixed and closed in there. But there is an extreme resistance to accept that truth. And that perhaps marks the difference between Canada and Europe, because at least in Canada, there's an acknowledgement of this messiness, of this impossibility of fixing what it means to be Canadian, so that we actually endlessly debate. And we will never be fully, come to a closure, which actually we shouldn't come to a closure, because when we come to a closure, that's where we run into a trouble.
Thank you, Roman. Good.
Yeah, I'm just, I'm going to respond a bit more directly to the question I think you asked about economics and class, but I think it kind of relates to the language thing. That if we said people can access services in the language of their choice, at some point that would become a debate about resources, right? How much money does that cost? How, and so there's always the danger of that, because there is this underlying, and not often underlying, but there is the anti-immigrant discourse is often about people, and this happens everywhere, people coming and taking our jobs and using our services, rather than, the flip side in Canada is in fact people coming here to keep our economy going. But that's a discourse that's used. So I think those debates around language would become prey to that. But also it's I think accessing certain services in a language of a language of origin is fine, but that's not actually going to work for the education system. It's not going to work for the service sector industries or the banking industry, or so there is we're stuck with some things because of history, and it's most of you know, a lot of what we deal with is inheritance, I think, over choice, and it's about how do we navigate that, you know, productively. You know, I've often wondered whether more socially equal societies in terms of social welfare and fairer tax policies are better at managing multiculturalism. And Canada, you know, you think about the differences between Canada and the US on that basis, and we're a much more equal society, you know, in terms of economic inequalities. But you have these very strong social democratic societies, particularly Scandinavia, that are literally losing their core values over multiculturalism. You know, they're taking Danish citizens, as Spacey pointed out, and surveilling them in a way that you can't, you know, you wouldn't accept, right? So, and those are economically much more equal societies even than I think we are. So that doesn't seem to be the solution either, although I'm not saying we shouldn't have that. I think that's really important because, you know, extreme poverty for, you know, for any group is going to make, you know, them less able to be included in society. So you know, that's always been a disappointment to me, that economic social welfare doesn't actually provide a threshold. It doesn't seem to, in the research that we have, provide a threshold level of being able to live together well. So you know, I think we do have to confront that there is this underlying version of national identity that is connected with certain forms of race. And that is probably more difficult in Europe because there are more actively colonial countries that have inherited that. And I think one of the really big problems, and we suffer this in Canada too, is that our general public culture, and particularly our education system, you know, doesn't deliver an honest account of not just the colonial era, but the colonial era as a capitalist era that was about economic development. So the countries that are richest in the world right now are countries that have remained rich from the era of colonialism. So there's a link between our economic development in the West, our capitalist economic development, and our relationship with indigenous peoples and people from the global South. And, you know, until we're able to have a set of public resources where people have learned those facts, can talk about those facts a bit more openly and find a way to navigate, I think we're always going to butt up against this liberal, limited version of multiculturalism, which doesn't have the resources, and we're not giving the resources for people to think through how we arrived here, right? Like there's no recognition of the kind of long-term historical patterns that are going on. And so if you don't have those resources to explain how you arrived here, you default to, oh, we're here because we're successful. And as Don Cherry said a few years ago, the immigrants are coming here to take our milk and honey. Like that becomes the explanation. Or they're from a different civilization that has been completely separated from ours until this recent era of migration, instead of, no, we actually used to own those civilizations. We colonized them. That's why we have that relationship. You know, so I think that lack of historical context makes it much more difficult for us to develop public ways of understanding this, that can address that question of how can we live together, knowing what our history has been of living together. So that, you know, there's this idea that the West's success in economic development and civilizational values is somehow separate from its colonialism, where it's not. It was based on extraction. The French denied democracy to its colonies, even as it was developing it within France. And of course, people in Algeria, groups went and said, well, we'd like to have representative government too, and have some self-determination. They were told, no, you're not ready for democracy. You can just be part of, you know, the French National Assembly, but you can't be your own culture. So there was a denial, there was an underdevelopment of other cultures. They were prevented from developing particular successful ways because of colonialism, because of economics. And we just don't have a good way of talking about that would allow us to navigate, you know, how we develop ways that acknowledge that now, and move beyond it. And so I think you know, the class question and the economic question is fundamentally kind of important, but we need to have a history of that. We need to have an understanding of that, which, you know, it also allows us to think about whether contemporary Canadian immigration policy is a form of neo-colonialism. There are some people that argue this. We're extracting educated people from the global south.
We are.
And telling them to come here and to build our economy. Now, you know, that's, I don't think that's going to change, but that's partly what we're doing.
Moment, something I'd like to query on the history note that you rightly talk about. That history, I'll go back to Andy's initial presentation. That history is increasingly distant from the Canadian population, the more that we have other people from other histories coming to Canada. And I see that, so I see both of those things. Do you have a comment about that? And then we're probably gonna have to wrap up shortly after that.
It's distant from some of the new immigrants in one way, in the sense that it's not, you know, we're not part of Anglo-French settlement, but we, you know, we're also a continuation of settlement. But it's not that different in other ways. Like, I'm a Brit. I'm only a Brit because my family immigrated from Bangladesh because there was a colonial relationship between the UK and South Asia. You know, we have people coming from the Philippines. You know, there were colonial relationships there, Indonesia. Like, there's a common historical discourse there of global capitalism and colonialism that, you know, we wouldn't teach it in the way we would at university level, but in our education system, maybe we could do a more honest, I would actually say a more objective and more honest version of history that encompasses the global, because we were living in global, you know, we've been living in very connected global economic and military and political relationships for at least 400 or 500 years. Like, it isn't something new. So I think there's a broader, and it's not just adding in different histories, it's actually, in my view, doing a much more honest and fuller account of what actually happened historically, rather than this narrow view of you know, Canadian Anglo-French history. So, you know, we as educators, you know, have not, I think, reached up to this task yet in full measure, both at university and at you know, school level.
Thank you. And before I do closing remarks, Andy, do you have anything else you'd like to add in terms of any of the conversation that's been happening?
Yeah, you know, it brings me back to thinking about the current two-tiered nature of our immigration system and the reality of so many immigrants who have precarious status, you know, particularly as temporary workers, and the ongoing kind of colonial nature of that. It's unclear exactly, you know, why someone gets in, why they don't, why the rules are what they are, you know, and there's a sense that we only want certain people but not others, and yet I think it, you know, comes back to what Mohammed was saying, is why don't we center the economic argument for immigration? And if we're doing that, then that would clearly point to the conclusion that we need people who are willing to do jobs of all skill levels, and that it's fine that their lives and their career may lead them out of that. You know, if I had a kid who was 16 and working at Tim Hortons, I would be happy, you know, if she turned 19 and got a better job and moved on from that. So why do we feel reluctant to let migrant farm workers make the transition towards citizenship and away from that low-paid, challenging physical labor? You know, clearly we're going to need someone else to come in and do that, but why do we resist that? So, you know, that's where my mind goes, and I think it's important to not leave those people out of the picture.
I think it's really important for us to keep remembering and bring this back to Peterborough, people on the ground. How is this, are these ideas impacting them? I think of Mohammed, your phrase of post-multicultural nation, and Joseph Kertes talks about a post-national state. And I think these are wonderful notions from my perspective. I wonder if we can get there. I think we can. I think we have more of a chance in Canada than many, many other places. And maybe because of that messy history that, that Faisy talked about. So our time is now up, and I want to thank everyone who has attended this important discussion. Many countries around the world are becoming home to increasing numbers of people from diverse backgrounds, lived experiences, cultures, languages, appearances, ways of being. Many of us celebrate the richness that this phenomenon brings. Our speakers today caution that we need to be aware of the challenges that both newcomers and our societies may face. This has been a very thought-provoking session. Special thanks go to our speakers, Mohammed Rahman, Faisy Baban, and Andy Cragg. And I'd like to give a shout out to Yvonne Lai, the NCC Director of Community Development, for organizing this event and providing tech support. Thank you all so very much for joining us today.